it's just me that has thought about putting comic books on a tumbler, but this past weekend we went to Universal Studios and my son loves all of this stuff. So while we were at one of the shops, I saw this comic book and I was like, that would be so badass on a tumbler. Like for you to pick up the tumbler, look at it, it's got the barcode and everything, like it is literally the cover of the comic book. And I was like, I'm gonna buy it, take it home, put it on a tumbler, make it a tutorial. What a perfect way to preserve it. And not only that, but for my son to be able to walk around with this, amazing. So if you wanna learn how I did this, keep watching. The moment I saw this comic book at Universal Studios, I knew I immediately had to put it on a cup for my son. I had to. So what I did was I started out by cutting out the whole first page. The fun thing about making comic book tumblers is that you can kind of piece it together however you want, but I knew that I wanted this entire Venom cover on the cup. I wanted you to look at this cup and be like, is that a comic book? Why, yes, indeedy, it is a comic book. So I wanted to make sure that the price was on there and the little scanny label thingy, barcode. It's called a barcode. I wanted to make sure that the barcode was on there and everything like that. So I started off by just cutting out the page, and then I just kind of went in and trimmed off all the little, flyaway pieces of paper that were hanging off. Then what I did was I got my ketchup condiment bottle full of Mod Podge and I laid my first coat of Mod Podge. Now this is important, guys. The comic book paper on these books is very thin. It's very, very, very thin paper. So you do not want to get your cup super wet because if you do, the more wet that your paper gets, the more fragile and easy for it to rip. So you kind of want to do a very thin coat where you're going to put your first page and just allow it to dry and get tacky enough. Not fully dry, but just allow it to get tacky enough for it to grab onto the paper, because we do not want to get that paper soaked yet. Otherwise, while you're rubbing bubbles out and stuff like that, it's gonna rip. So I like to place all decals, anything that I'm placing on a cup, I like to place it while it's standing up. It just allows me to always do it straight. What I did was I placed it in the center and then took my fat sausage fingers and just kind of started rubbing from the center out to push out any air bubbles, okay? Now, it's kind of hard because this is very thin paper, so you can't be so rough with it, but it's okay. If you place your paper and you get a little bit, like once you have it on there, you notice that you have a few air bubbles left in the middle, do not worry, do not be sad. You will be able to push those down and kind of flatten them. And I know that it will make your paper look a little wrinkly, but I promise you, when everything is all said and done and you've got epoxy on the cup, you're not going to be able to tell. After all, it is paper we're working with, so no big deal. So what I did was I just took a paper towel and kind of glided it over gently, and there was a few areas that had bubbles and I just kind of pushed them down. As soon as I knew that the rim and the bottom were completely adhered, I went ahead and sealed with my first coat of Mod Podge. Do not move into this step until you know that there is no space in between your comic book paper and your tumbler. Every single section, every single inch of that paper needs to be 100% adhered to your tumbler, not a single little space lifted, or that is going to compromise your whole cup because epoxy can get under it and you don't want that. So just the way you would do scrapbook paper, just the way you would do fabric or vinyl, you need to make sure everything is completely pressed down. And once you have it secure, go in with a very thin coat of Mod Podge. Mod Podge, you want to do in thin coats, otherwise it will not dry clear. Now, the great thing about keeping a blow dryer around, I like to use cool air, by the way. That's why I use a blow dryer and not a heat gun. I use cool air to dry my Mod Podge faster. And here, what you see me doing is pushing down a little bit where I saw that my paper was just a tiny bit lifted. I was pushing it down just to make sure that it was completely adhered to the tumbler. Not to worry, you can still continue to do this after you have put your first coat of Mod Podge over the paper. The reason we want to immediately secure this with Mod Podge over it is because, like I mentioned before, it's very, very thin paper, and once it's wet, it's a little bit faster, easier for it to get damaged. So as soon as we know we have it secured on the cup, we want to seal it and protect it immediately. Look how cute that is with just one coat. But I went ahead and did 2 coats and then set it off to the side just to make sure that while I go on placing my other decals, that it's not going to damage the one paper that we already put on there. Now for this part, you're gonna see lots of sets of hands and you probably can't tell which one are my son's and which ones are mine because I have sausage man hands. But my sweet firstborn, David, he's 17. I called him downstairs because he loves all these kinds of movies. He knows everything about them. He's super geeky. I love it. I wouldn't change anything about him. And I wanted him to let me know what would look best on the cup because, you know, I'm going to give it to him because he's my little Gigi. Even though Jenny's so shady and yesterday was like, are you going to give that to me? You know David loves these movies. Jenny, that was a little shady. But anyway, we're going to see. I'm sure they will share. I will probably have to make another one, but I don't have another comic book. I only bought one while I was at Universal. What? Also, disclaimer, I am not using any of these images for commercial use. I am not going to sell them. I am simply using this particular comic book for teaching purposes to show you how to adhere comic book paper to a tumbler. I just wanted to throw that little disclaimer in there. So after discussing with my son and him pointing out the best parts and the things that he thought I should include on the tumbler, I went to work and started cutting them out. I fast forwarded through that part because it took me a minute. It took me a little minute, but it's okay. It's all good. I was watching Netflix on my iPad. Now, what I recommend before you start gluing things down is measure your pieces, make sure that they're going to fit good. I did want them to overlap, but I didn't want them to overlap over the cover on the other side too much because I love the fact that on one side it just looks like a whole comic book. So, measure them and kind of play Tetris for a little bit before you start laying them down. The best advice I can give you on the planet is after every single piece of after every single piece of comic book paper that you place, immediately seal it with Mod Podge and hit it with your blow dryer. I attempted to make a comic book tumbler 2 years ago, and it's beautiful. I will show it to you. Honestly, I probably already showed it to you in the intro of this video. The problem with that tumbler is that I placed Mod Podge and started placing all of my comic book paper, but I wasn't sealing over the paper as I was going. And so my scrapbook, I keep calling it scrapbook paper. My comic book paper started lifting in certain areas because it was wet, and so it started to get wrinkled. And there was nothing I could do to fix it because once Mod Podge fully dries, it gets hard. It gets really hard, and then it's impossible for you to make any adjustments. So any piece of comic book paper that you put on this tumbler, once you have it secure, completely adhered, and you know that there's no sections, no little parts where it is lifting, immediately seal it with Mod Podge before you move on to the next step. You will thank me later. That's why I always tell you guys, do not ever be afraid to experiment. Most of everything I have learned by just jumping in and giving it a try and making mistakes. And that tumbler that I made before, it's beautiful. Even though it's not safe to drink out of because the seal is compromised, it has been in my son's room on a shelf on display for decoration because it is just so cute. So I've always wanted to remake that tumbler because I was so inexperienced when I attempted it. And all this time I've known what I did wrong and how I could fix it. I just had not had the chance to dive into this again. But it is very important now for me to show you how to do it now that I know how to properly get this comic book paper onto my tumbler. Now, as you can see, I am just kind of playing Tetris and putting my pieces down, and then as I'm going, I'm just placing Mod Podge. Now, it's okay for you to go over all of your pieces of comic book paper again after every time you seal a new piece, because I mean, the more thin coats you get over everything, the more sealed and protected it's going to be. So not a big deal. Just make sure that your coats are fully, full coverage and thin like me. Just kidding. And make sure that you're fully letting them dry before you go in with your next coat of Mod Podge. If you're using a blow dryer, it's going to take less than 2 minutes for each coat to fully dry for you to move on to the next section. If you place Mod Podge over a wet coat, it's not ever going to dry clear. I just want to stress that again. So basically, here you see me just continuing the process and placing pieces of comic book paper where I think. Now, one of the coolest features of this cup that I thought was cool is that I took a huge, picture of Venom and I completely cut it out and I placed it on top, like overlapped it, and I thought it looked really, really, really cool. I also made sure that one of the sections at the top, the little word bubble, I made sure it was overlapping so it looked just really cool. Now, like I mentioned before, you may have a little bit of wrinkles after you're all done, like a little bit of wrinkles in the comic book paper. That's normal, guys. We're working with paper. We're getting it wet. There's only so much we can do. However, this is a great hack. Take some parchment paper, roll it like a burrito, get your Chipotle on. Chipotle is my life. Get your Chipotle on. Use your fat sausage, busted can of biscuit ass hands. Push down as much as you can. You can even take a little squeegee and just push down on the tumbler. And this is just going to ensure that any wrinkles that were left or air bubbles that got left underneath, you completely made them lay flat like my booty. And that's what you want. Once you're completely done, your Mod Podge layers are dry and you're ready for epoxy, how we're going to finish the bottom is going to be with chalk paint, okay? Now, when I do the side at the bottom, you'll see in a second, my line is not going to be perfectly straight. Not to worry. We just want to get all the black paint on there and get it fully covered, because once we come back to add our vinyl strips, we're going to place a vinyl strip right where the paint and the comic paper meet, and that's going to give us that crisp straight line. So don't worry about getting it super perfect when you're painting. Just worry about covering all of the tumbler so that it's completely black at the bottom. Once your chalk paint is dry, you can move into epoxy. You don't have to seal it. Just make sure it's dry. I did 40 mLs of epoxy, 20 of A, 20 of B. That is my go-to for a 32-ounce plump tumbler. I like to get a full, nice, thick coat on there, just so that when I go back and if I have to sand it before my next step, I'm not compromising and damaging all my hard work underneath. After I let it spin overnight and fully dry, we came back, and this is very important about the rim, okay? Take an X-Acto knife, angle it just slightly so that you are removing just a tiny little bit of comic book paper from the very top. You want just the slightest bit of stainless steel exposed at the very, very top. The reason this is important is because when you go over this to seal with another coat of epoxy, that epoxy is going to grab onto that tiny little piece of stainless steel. And anytime that you wash this tumbler or do anything like that, you're never going to get any water get underneath and get that comic book paper wet. So that part is very important. Now we're going to move on to our vinyl strips, okay? I did wipe down my tumbler after I sanded it and did the X-Acto knife with alcohol and, what is it called? Paper towels, Then I just took washi tape and I just kind of started placing it where all of the straight lines on the tumbler should be. The really cool thing about you doing this is that if you look at comic books, they typically have a black line, like a black frame around each picture. So by me doing this, it just kind of made it look even more like a comic book to have those lines. So this is pretty self-explanatory, guys. You just want to try to hold your washi tape and keep it as straight as possible to hide where the two pieces of, comic book paper meet. And then this part that you see me doing right here at the top, I'm just bringing that washi tape and then just cutting it right where that little bubble starts. And now to do the other side, I lined it up with that bottom piece of washi tape, and then I just cut around the bubble. And I just feel like that made it look flawless and super duper cute. And it just gave it a very clean, finish. Use your X-Acto knife to cut off any excess. Make sure you're pushing down your vinyl super good so that it's fully adhered, okay? Here, you see me going back and getting that vinyl over the bottom so we could get that perfectly straight line that we were talking about. This is not foil or holographic, so I didn't have to seal it. I went ahead and added my epoxy. I did 2 coats of 40 mLs just to make sure I had it fully sealed, and this is what we ended up with. I hope you love this tumbler. Besitos!